This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Casper. Sea Stories, edited by Cyrus Townsend Brady. Story 7. My First Voyage, from 2 years before the mast, by R.H. Dana, Jr. The 14th day of August was the day fixed upon for the sailing of the brig Pilgrim on her voyage from Boston round Cape Horn to the western coast of North America. As she was to get under way early in the afternoon, I made my appearance on board at 12 o'clock, in full sea rig, and with my chest, containing an outfit for a 2 or 3 years' voyage, which I had undertaken from a determination to cure, if possible, by an entire change of life, and by a long absence from books and study, a weakness of the eyes which had obliged me to give up my pursuits, and which no medical aid seemed likely to cure. The change from the tight dress coat, silk cap, and kid gloves of an undergraduate at Cambridge, to the loose duck trousers, checked shirt, and tarpaulin hat of a sailor, though somewhat of a transformation, was soon made, and I supposed that I should pass very well for a jack tar. But it is impossible to deceive the practised eye in these matters, and while I supposed myself to be looking as salt as Neptune himself, I was no doubt known for a landsman by every one on board as soon as I hove in sight. A sailor has a peculiar cut to his clothes, and a way of wearing them which a green hand can never get. The trousers tight round the hips, and thence hanging long and loose round the feet, a superabundance of checked shirt, a low crowned, well varnished black hat, worn on the back of the head, with half a fathom of black ribbon hanging over the left eye, and a peculiar tie to the black silk neckerchief, with sundry other minutiae, are signs the want of which betrayed the beginner at once. Besides the points in my dress which were out of the way, doubtless my complexion and hands were enough to distinguish me from the regular salt, who, with a sunburnt cheek, wide step, and rolling gait, swings his broad and toughened hands athwart ships, half open, as though just ready to grasp a rope. With all my imperfections on my head, I joined the crew, and we hauled out into the stream, and came to anchor for the night. The next day we were employed in preparations for sea, reeving studding sail gear, crossing royal yards, putting on chafing gear, and taking on board our powder. On the following night I stood my first watch. I remained awake nearly all the first part of the night, from fear that I might not hear when I was called; and when I went on deck, so great were my ideas of the importance of my trust, that I walked regularly fore and aft the whole length of the vessel, looking out over the bows and taffrail at each turn, and was not a little surprised at the coolness of the old salt whom I called to take my place, in stowing himself snugly away under the long boat for a nap. That was a sufficient lookout, he thought, for a fine night at anchor in a safe harbor. The next morning was Saturday, and a breeze having sprung up from the southward, we took a pilot on board, hove up our anchor, and began beating down the bay. I took leave of those of my friends who came to see me off, and had barely opportunity to take a last look at the city and well known objects, as no time is allowed on board ship for sentiment. As we drew down into the lower harbor, we found the wind ahead in the bay, and we were obliged to come to anchor in the roads. We remained there through the day and a part of the night. My watch began at 11 o'clock at night, and I received orders to call the captain if the wind came out from the westward. About midnight the wind became fair, and having called the captain, I was ordered to call all hands. How I accomplished this I do not know, but I am quite sure that I did not give the true hoarse boatswain call of "All hands, up anchor ahoy!" In a short time every one was in motion, the sails loosed, the yards braced, and we began to heave up the anchor, which was our last hold upon Yankee land. I could take but little part in these preparations. My little knowledge of a vessel was all at fault. Unintelligible orders were so rapidly given and so immediately executed. There was such a hurrying about, and such an intermingling of strange cries and strange actions, that I was completely bewildered. There is not so helpless and pitiable an object in the world as a landsman beginning a sailor's life. At length those peculiar long drawn sounds, which denote that the crew are heaving at the windlass, began, and in a few moments we were under way. The noise of the water thrown from the bows began to be heard, the vessel leaned over from the damp night breeze, and rolled with a heavy ground swell, and we had actually begun our long, long journey. This was literally bidding good night to my native land. The first day we passed at sea was the Sabbath. As we were just from port, and there was a great deal to be done on board, we were kept at work all day, and at night the watches were set, and everything put into sea order. When we were called aft to be divided into watches, I had a good specimen of the manner of a sea captain. After the division had been made, he gave a short characteristic speech, walking the quarter deck with a cigar in his mouth, and dropping the words out between the puffs. "Now, my men, we have begun a long voyage. If we get along well together, we shall have a comfortable time. If we don't, we shall have hell afloat. All you've got to do is obey your orders and do your duty like men. Then you'll fare well enough. If you don't, you'll fare hard enough, I can tell you. If we pull together, you'll find me a clever fellow. If we don't, you'll find me a bloody rascal. That's all I've got to say. Go below the larboard watch." I, being in the starboard or second mate's watch, had the opportunity of keeping the first watch at sea. A young man, making like myself his first voyage, was in the same watch, and as he was the son of a professional man, and had been in a counting room in Boston, we found that we had many friends and topics in common. We talked these matters over, Boston, what our friends were probably doing, our voyage, etc., until he went to take his turn at the lookout, and left me to myself. I now had a fine time for reflection. I felt for the first time the perfect silence of the sea. The officer was walking the quarter deck, where I had no right to go. One or two men were talking on the forecastle, whom I had little inclination to join, so that I was left open to the full impression of everything about me. However much I was affected by the beauty of the sea, the bright stars, and the clouds driven swiftly over them, I could not but remember that I was separating myself from all the social and intellectual enjoyments of life. Yet, strange as it may seem, I did then and afterward take pleasure in these reflections, hoping by them to prevent my becoming insensible to the value of what I was leaving. But all my dreams were soon put to flight by an order from the officer to trim the yards, as the wind was getting ahead, and I could plainly see by the looks the sailors occasionally cast to the windward, and by the dark clouds that were fast coming up, that we had bad weather to prepare for, and had heard the captain say that he expected to be in the Gulf Stream by 12 o'clock. In a few minutes 8 bells were struck, the watch called, and we went below. I now began to feel the first discomforts of a sailor's life. The steerage in which I lived was filled with coils of rigging, spare sails, old junk, and ship's stores which had not been stowed away. Moreover, there had been no berths built for us to sleep in, and we were not allowed to drive nails to hang our clothes upon. The sea, too, had risen, and the vessel was rolling heavily, and everything was pitched about in grand confusion. There was a complete hurrah's nest, as the sailors say, everything on top and nothing at hand. A large hawser had been coiled away upon my chest. My hats, boots, mattress, and blankets had all fetched away and gone over leeward, and were all jammed and broken under the boxes and coils of rigging. To crown all, we were allowed no light to find anything with, and I was just beginning to feel strong symptoms of seasickness, and that listlessness and inactivity which accompany it. Giving up all attempt to collect my things together, I lay down upon the sails, expecting every moment to hear the cry of "All hands ahoy!" which the approaching storm would soon make necessary. I shortly heard the raindrops falling on deck, thick and fast, and the watch evidently had their hands full of work, for I could hear the loud and repeated orders of the mate, the trampling of feet, the creaking of blocks, and all the accompaniments of a coming storm. In a few minutes the slide of the hatch was thrown back, which let down the noise and tumult of the deck still louder. The loud cry of "All hands ahoy! Tumble up here and take in sail!" saluted our ears, and the hatch was quickly shut again. When I got upon deck, a new scene and a new experience was before me. The little brig was close hauled upon the wind, and lying over, as it then seemed to me, nearly upon her beam ends. The heavy head sea was beating against her bows with the noise and force almost of a sledge hammer, and flying over the deck, drenching us completely through. The topsail halyards had been let go, and the great sails were filling out and backing against the masts with a noise like thunder. The wind was whistling through the rigging, loose ropes flying about, loud and to me unintelligible orders constantly given and rapidly executed, and the sailors singing out at the ropes in their hoarse and peculiar strains. In addition to all this, I had not got my sea legs on, was dreadfully sick, with hardly strength enough to hold on to anything, and it was pitch dark. This was my state when I was ordered aloft for the first time to reef topsails. How I got along I cannot now remember. I laid out on the yards and held on with all my strength. I could not have been of much service, for I remember having been sick several times before I left the topsail yard. Soon all was snug aloft, and we were again allowed to go below. This I did not consider much of a favor, for the confusion of everything below, and the inexpressible sickening smell, caused by the shaking up of the bilge water in the hold, made the steerage but an indifferent refuge from the cold wet decks. I had often read of the nautical experiences of others, but I felt as though there could be none worse than mine, for in addition to every other evil, I could not but remember that this was only the first night of a 2 years' voyage. When we were on deck we were not much better off, for we were continually ordered about by the officer, who said that it was good for us to be in motion. Yet anything was better than the horrible state of things below. I remember very well going to the hatchway and putting my head down when I was oppressed by nausea, and always being relieved immediately. It was as good as an emetic. This state of things continued for 2 days. Wednesday, August 20th. We had the watch on deck from 4 till 8 this morning. When we came on deck at 4 o'clock, we found things much changed for the better. The sea and wind had gone down, and the stars were out bright. I experienced a corresponding change in my feelings, yet continued extremely weak from my sickness. I stood in the waist on the weather side, watching the gradual breaking of the day, and the first streaks of the early light. Much has been said of the sunrise at sea, but it will not compare with the sunrise on shore. It wants the accompaniments of the songs of birds, the awakening hum of men, and the glancing of the first beams upon trees, hills, spires, and housetops, to give it life and spirit. But though the actual rise of the sun at sea is not so beautiful, yet nothing will compare with the early breaking of day upon the wide ocean. There is something in the first gray streaks stretching along the eastern horizon, and throwing an indistinct light upon the face of the deep, which combines with the boundlessness and unknown depth of the sea round you, and gives one a feeling of loneliness, of dread, and of melancholy foreboding, which nothing else in nature can give. This gradually passes away as the light grows brighter, and when the sun comes up, the ordinary monotonous sea day begins. From such reflections as these, I was aroused by the order from the officer, "Forward there, rig the head pump." I found that no time was allowed for day dreaming, but that we must turn to at the first light. Having called up the idlers, namely, carpenter, cook, steward, etc., and rigged the pump, we commenced washing down the decks. This operation, which is performed every morning at sea, takes nearly 2 hours, and I had hardly strength enough to get through it. After we had finished, swabbed down and coiled up the rigging, I sat down on the spars, waiting for 7 bells, which was the sign for breakfast. The officer, seeing my lazy posture, ordered me to slush the mainmast, from the royal masthead down. The vessel was then rolling a little, so that I felt tempted to tell him that I had rather wait till after breakfast, but I knew that I must take the bull by the horns, and that if I showed any sign of want of spirit or of backwardness, that I should be ruined at once. So I took my bucket of grease and climbed up to the royal masthead. Here the rocking of the vessel, which increases the higher you go from the foot of the mast, which is the fulcrum of the lever, and the smell of the grease, which offended my fastidious senses, upset my stomach again, and I was not a little rejoiced when I got upon the comparative terra firma of the deck. In a few minutes 7 bells were struck, the log hove, the watch called, and we went to breakfast. Here I cannot but remember the advice of the cook, a simple–hearted African. "Now," said he, "my lad, you are well cleaned out. You haven't got a drop of your 'longshore swash aboard of you. You must begin on a new tack, pitch all your sweetmeats overboard, and turn to upon good hearty salt beef and sea bread, and I'll promise you, you'll have your ribs well sheathed, and be as hearty as any of 'em, before you are up to the Horn." This would be good advice to give passengers when they speak of the little niceties which they have laid in case of seasickness. I cannot describe the change which half a pound of cold salt beef and a biscuit or two produced in me. I was a new being. We had a watch below until noon, so that I had some time to myself, and getting a huge piece of strong cold salt beef from the cook, I kept gnawing upon it until 12 o'clock. When we went on deck, I felt somewhat like a man, and could begin to learn my sea duty with considerable spirit. At about 2 o'clock we heard the loud cry of "Sail ho!" from aloft, and soon saw 2 sails to windward, going directly athwart our hawse. This was the first time that I had seen a sail at sea. I thought then, and have always since, that it exceeds every other sight in interest and beauty. They passed to leeward of us, and out of hailing distance, but the captain could read the names on their sterns with the glass. They were the ship Helen Mar of New York, and the brig Mermaid of Boston. They were both steering westward, and were bound in for our dear native land. Thursday, August 21st. This day the sun rose clear, we had a fine wind, and everything was bright and cheerful. I had now got my sea legs on, and was beginning to enter upon the regular duties of a sea life. About 6 bells, that is 3 o'clock P.M., we saw a sail on our larboard bow. I was very anxious, like every new sailor, to speak her. She came down to us, backed her main topsail, and the 2 vessels stood head on, bowing and curvetting at each other like a couple of war horses reined in by their riders. It was the first vessel that I had seen near, and I was surprised to find how much she rolled and pitched in so quiet a sea. She plunged her head into the sea, and then, her stern settling gradually down, her huge bows rose up, showing the bright copper, and her stern and breast hooks dripping, like old Neptune's locks, with the brine. Her decks were filled with passengers, who had come up at the cry of "Sail ho!" and who, by their dress and features, appeared to be Swiss and French emigrants. She hailed us in French, but receiving no answer, she tried us in English. She was the ship La Carolina, from Havre for New York. We desired her to report the brig Pilgrim from Boston for the northwest coast of America 5 days out. She then filled away and left us to plow on through our waste of waters. This day ended pleasantly. We had got into regular and comfortable weather, and into that routine of sea life which is only broken by a storm, a sail, or the sight of land. As we had now a long spell of fine weather, without any incident to break the monotony of our lives, there can be no better place to describe the duties, regulations, and customs of an American merchantman, of which ours was a fair specimen. The captain, in the first place, is lord paramount. He stands no watch, comes and goes when he pleases, and is accountable to no one, and must be obeyed in everything, without a question, even from his chief officer. He has the power to turn his officers off duty, and even to break them and make them do duty as sailors in the forecastle. Where there are no passengers and no supercargo, as in our vessel, he has no companion but his own dignity, and no pleasures, unless he differs from most of his kind, but the consciousness of possessing supreme power, and occasionally the exercise of it. The prime minister, the official organ, and the active and superintending officer, is the chief mate. He is first lieutenant, boatswain, sailing master, and quartermaster. The captain tells him what he wishes to have done, and leaves to him the care of overseeing, of allotting the work, and also the responsibility of its being well done. The mate, as he is always called par excellence, also keeps the log book, for which he is responsible to the owners and insurers, and has the charge of the stowage, safekeeping, and delivery of the cargo. He is also, ex officio, the wit of the crew, for the captain does not condescend to joke with the men, and the second mate no one cares for, so that when the mate thinks fit to entertain the people with a coarse joke or a little practical wit, every one feels bound to laugh. The second mate's is proverbially a dog's berth. He is neither officer nor man. The men do not respect him as an officer, and he is obliged to go aloft, to reef and furl the topsails, and to put his hands into the tar and slush with the rest. The crew call him the sailor's waiter, as he has to furnish them with spun yarn, marline, and all the other stuffs that they need in their work, and has charge of the boatswain's locker, which includes serving boards, marline spikes, etc. He is expected to maintain his dignity and to enforce obedience, and still is kept at a great distance from the mate, and obliged to work with the crew. He is one to whom little is given, and of whom much is required. His wages are usually double those of a common sailor, and he eats and sleeps in the cabin, but he is obliged to be on deck nearly all his time, and eats at the second table, that is, makes a meal out of what the captain and chief mate leave. The steward is the captain's servant, and has charge of the pantry, from which every one, even the mate himself, is excluded. These distinctions usually find him an enemy in the mate, who does not like to have any one on board who is not entirely under his control. The crew do not consider him as one of their number, so he is left to the mercy of the captain. The cook is the patron of the crew, and those who are in his favor can get their wet mittens and stockings dried, or light their pipes at the galley in the night watch. These two worthies, together with the carpenter and sail maker, if there be one, stand no watch, but being employed all day, are allowed to sleep in at night, unless all hands are called. The crew are divided into two divisions, as equally as may be, called the watches. Of these the chief mate commands the larboard, and the second mate the starboard. They divide the time between them, being on and off duty, or, as it is called, on deck and below, every other 4 hours. If, for instance, the chief mate with the larboard watch have the first night watch from 8 to 12, at the end of the 4 hours the starboard watch is called, and the second mate takes the deck, while the larboard watch and the first mate go below until 4 in the morning, when they come on deck again and remain until 8, having what is called the morning watch, as they will have been on deck 8 hours out of the 12, while those who had the middle watch from 12 to 4 will only have been up 4 hours. They have what is called a forenoon watch below, that is from 8 a.m. till 12 a.m. In a man of war, and in some merchantmen, this alternation of watches is kept up throughout the 24 hours. But our ship, like most merchantmen, had all hands from 12 o'clock to dark, except in bad weather, when we had watch and watch. An explanation of the dog watches may perhaps be of use to one who has never been at sea. They are to shift the watches each night, so that the same watch need not be on deck at the same hours. In order to effect this, the watch from 4 to 8 a.m. is divided into 2 half or dog watches, one from 4 to 6, and the other from 6 to 8. By this means they divide the 24 hours into 7 watches instead of 6, and thus shift the hours every night. As the dog watches come during twilight, after the day's work is done and before the night watch is set, they are the watches in which everybody is on deck. The captain is up, walking on the weather side of the quarter deck, the chief mate on the lee side, and the second mate about the weather gangway. The steward has finished his work in the cabin, and has come up to smoke his pipe with the cook in the galley. The crew are sitting on the windlass, or lying on the forecastle, smoking, singing, or telling long yarns. At 8 o'clock, 8 bells are struck, the log is hove, the watch set, the wheel relieved, the galley shut up, and the other watch goes below. The morning commences with the watch on deck turning to at daybreak, and washing down, scrubbing, and swabbing the decks. This, together with filling the scuttled butt with fresh water and coiling up the rigging, usually occupies the time until 7 bells, half after 7, when all hands get breakfast. At 8 the day's work begins, and lasts until sundown, with the exception of an hour for dinner. Before I end my explanations, it may be well to define a day's work, and to correct a mistake prevalent among landsmen about a sailor's life. Nothing is more common than to hear people say, "Are not sailors very idle at sea? What can they find to do?" This is a very natural mistake, and being very frequently made, it is one which every sailor feels interested in having corrected. In the first place, then, the discipline of the ship requires every man to be at work upon something when he is on deck, except at night and on Sundays. Except at these times, you will never see a man on board a well-ordered vessel standing idle on deck, sitting down, or leaning over the side. It is the officer's duty to keep every one at work, even if there is nothing to be done but to scrape the rust from the cabin cables. In no state prison are the convicts more regularly set to work, and more closely watched. No conversation is allowed among the crew at their duty, and though they frequently do talk when aloft or when near one another, yet they always stop when an officer is nigh. With regard to the work upon which the men are put, it is a matter which probably would not be understood by one who has not been at sea. When I first left port, and found that we were kept regularly employed for a week or two, I supposed that we were getting the vessel into sea trim, and that it would soon be over, and we should have nothing to do but to sail the ship. But I found that it continued so for 2 years, and at the end of the 2 years there was as much to be done as ever. As has often been said, a ship is like a lady's watch, always out of repair. When first leaving port, studding sail gear is to be rove, all the running rigging to be examined, that which is unfit for use to be got down, and new rigging rove in its place. Then the standing rigging is to be overhauled, replaced, and repaired in 1,000 different ways, and wherever any of the numberless ropes or the yards are chafing or wearing upon it, their chafing gear, as it is called, must be put on. This chafing gear consists of worming, parceling, roundings, battens, and service of all kinds, both rope yarns, spun yarn, marline, and seizing stuffs. Taking off, putting on, and mending the chafing gear alone upon a vessel would find constant employment for 2 or 3 men during working hours for a whole voyage. The next point to be considered is, that all the small stuffs which are used on board a ship, such as spun yarn, marline, seizing stuff, etc., are made on board. The owners of a vessel buy up incredible quantities of old junk, which the sailors unlay after drawing out the yarns, knot them together, and roll them up in balls. These rope yarns are constantly used for various purposes, but the greater part is manufactured into spun yarn. For this purpose every vessel is furnished with a spun yarn winch, which is very simple, consisting of a wheel and spindle. This may be heard constantly going on deck in pleasant weather, and we had employment during a great part of the time for 3 hands in drawing and knotting yarns and making spun yarn. Another method of employing the crew is setting up rigging. Whenever any of the standing rigging becomes slack, which is continually happening, the seizing and coverings must be taken off, tackles got up, and after the rigging is bowsed well taut, the seizings and coverings replaced, which is a very nice piece of work. There is also such a connection between different parts of a vessel, that one rope can seldom be touched without altering another. You cannot stay a mast aft by the backstays without slacking up the headstays, etc. If we add to this all the tarring, greasing, oiling, varnishing, painting, scraping, and scrubbing, which is required in the course of a long voyage, and also remember this is all to be done in addition to watching at night, steering, reefing, furling, bracing, making and setting sail, and pulling, hauling, and climbing in every direction, one will hardly ask, what can a sailor find to do at sea? If after all this labor, after exposing their lives and limbs in storms, wet and cold, wherein the cub-drawn bear would couch, the lion and the belly-pinched wolf keep their furs dry, the merchants and captains think that they have not earned their $12 a month, out of which they clothe themselves, and their salt beef and hard bread, they keep them picking oakum ad infinitum. This is the usual resource upon a rainy day, for then it will not do to work upon rigging, and when it is pouring down in floods, instead of letting the sailors stand about in sheltered places and talk and keep themselves comfortable, they are separated to different parts of the ship and kept at work picking oakum. I have seen oakum stuff placed about in different parts of the ship, so that the sailors might not be idle in the snatches between the frequent squalls upon crossing the equator. Some officers have been so driven to find work for the crew in a ship ready for sea, that they have set them to pounding the anchors, often done, and scraping the chain cables. The Philadelphia Catechism is, 6 days shalt thou labor, and do all thou art able, and on the 7th holy stone the decks and scrape the cable. This kind of work, of course, is not kept up off Cape Horn, Cape of Good Hope, and in extreme north and south latitudes. But I have seen the decks washed down and scrubbed when the water would have frozen if it had been fresh, and all hands kept at work upon the rigging when we had on our pea jackets and our hands so numb that we could hardly hold our marline spikes. I have here gone out of my narrative course in order that any who read this may form as correct an idea of a sailor's life and duties as possible. I have done it in this place because for some time our life was nothing but the unvarying repetition of these duties, which can be better described together. Before leaving this description, however, I would state, in order to show landsmen how little they know of the nature of a ship, that a ship carpenter is kept in constant employ during good weather on board vessels which are in what is called perfect sea order. After speaking the Carolina on the 21st August, nothing occurred to break the monotony of our life until Friday, September 5th, when we saw a sail on our weather starboard beam. She proved to be a brig under English colors, and passing under our stern, reported herself as 49 days from Buenos Ayres, bound to Liverpool. Before she had passed us, "Sail ho!" was cried again, and we made another sail, far on our weather bow, and steering athwart our hawse. She passed out of hail, but we made her out to be a hermaphrodite brig, with Brazilian colors in her main rigging. By her course she must have been bound from Brazil to the south of Europe, probably Portugal. Sunday, September 7th. Fell in with the northeast trade winds. This morning we caught our first dolphin, which I was very eager to see. I was disappointed in the colors of this fish when dying. They were certainly very beautiful, but not equal to what has been said of them. They are too indistinct. To do the fish justice, there is nothing more beautiful than the dolphin when swimming a few feet below the surface on a bright day. It is the most elegantly formed, and also the quickest fish in salt water, and the rays of the sun striking upon it in its rapid and changing motions, reflected from the water, make it look like a stray beam from a rainbow. This day was spent like all pleasant Sabbaths at sea. The decks are washed down, the rigging coiled up, and everything put in order, and throughout the day only one watch is kept on deck at a time. The men are all dressed in their best white duck trousers and red or checked shirts, and have nothing to do but make the necessary changes in the sails. They employ themselves in reading, talking, smoking, and mending their clothes. If the weather is pleasant, they bring their work and their books upon deck, and sit down upon the forecastle and windlass. This is the only day on which these privileges are allowed them. When Monday comes, they put their tarry trousers on again, and prepare for 6 days of labor. To enhance the value of the Sabbath to the crew, they are allowed on that day a pudding, or, as it is called, a duff. This is nothing more than flour boiled with water and eaten with molasses. It is very heavy, dark, and clammy, yet it is looked upon as a luxury, and really forms an agreeable variety with salt beef and pork. Many a rascally captain has made friends of his crew by allowing them duff twice a week on the passage home. On board some vessels this is made a day of instruction and religious exercises, but we had a crew of swearers, from the captain to the smallest boy, and a day of rest and of something like quiet social enjoyment was all that we could expect. We continued running large before the northeast trade winds for several days, until Monday, September 22nd, when, upon coming on deck at 7 bells in the morning, we found the other watch aloft throwing water upon the sails, and looking astern, we saw a small clipper-built brig with a black hull heading directly after us. We went to work immediately, and put all the canvas upon the brig which we could get upon her, rigging out oars for studding sail yards, and continued wetting down the sails by buckets of water whipped up to the masthead, until about 9 o'clock, when there came on a drizzling rain. The vessel continued in pursuit, changing her course as we changed ours, to keep before the wind. The captain, who watched her with his glass, said that she was armed and full of men, and showed no colors. We continued running dead before the wind, knowing that we sailed better so, and that clippers are the fastest on the wind. We also had another advantage: the wind was light, and we spread more canvas than she did, having royals and skysails fore and aft, and 10 studding sails, while she, being a hermaphrodite brig, had only a gaff topsail aft. Early in the morning she was overhauling us a little, but after the rain came on and the wind grew lighter, we began to leave her astern. All hands remained on deck throughout the day, and we got our arms in order, but we were too few to have done anything with her if she had proved to be what we feared. Fortunately there was no moon, and the night which followed was exceeding dark, so that by putting out all the lights on board and altering her course 4 points, we hoped to get out of her reach. We had no light in the binnacle, but steered by the stars, and kept perfect silence through the night. At daybreak there was no sign of anything in the horizon, and we kept the vessel off to her course. Wednesday, October 1st. Crossed the equator in longitude 24 degrees 24 minutes west. I now for the first time felt at liberty, according to the old usage, to call myself a son of Neptune, and was very glad to be able to claim the title without the disagreeable initiation which so many have to go through. After once crossing the line, you can never be subjected to the process, but are considered as a son of Neptune, with full powers to play tricks upon others. This ancient custom is now seldom allowed, unless there are passengers on board, in which case there is always a good deal of sport. It had been obvious to all hands for some time that the second mate, whose name was Foster, was an idle, careless fellow, and not much of a sailor, and that the captain was exceedingly dissatisfied with him. The power of the captain in these cases was well known, and we all anticipated a difficulty. Foster, called Mr. by virtue of his office, was but half a sailor, having always been short voyages, and remained at home a long time between them. His father was a man of some property, and intended to have given his son a liberal education; but he, being idle and worthless, was sent off to sea, and succeeded no better there; for, unlike many scamps, he had none of the qualities of a sailor. He was not of the stuff that they make sailors of. He was one of the class of officers who are disliked by their captain and despised by the crew. He used to hold long yarns with the crew, and talk about the captain, and play with the boys, and relax discipline in every way. This kind of conduct always makes the captain suspicious, and is never pleasant in the end to the men. They prefer to have an officer active, vigilant, and distant as may be with kindness. Among other bad practices, he frequently slept on his watch, and having been discovered asleep by the captain, he was told that he would be turned off duty if he did it again. To prevent it in every way possible, the hen coops were ordered to be knocked up, for the captain never sat down on deck himself, and never permitted an officer to do so. The second night after crossing the equator we had the watch from 8 till 12, and it was my helm for the last 2 hours. There had been light squalls through the night, and the captain told Mr. Foster, who commanded our watch, to keep a bright lookout. Soon after I came to the helm, I found that he was quite drowsy, and at last he stretched himself on the companion and went fast asleep. Soon afterward the captain came very quietly on deck, and stood by me for some time looking at the compass. The officer at length became aware of the captain's presence, but pretending not to know it, began humming and whistling to himself, to show that he was not asleep, and went forward without looking behind him, and ordered the main royal to be loosed. On turning round to come aft, he pretended surprise at seeing the master on deck. This would not do. The captain was too wide awake for him, and beginning upon him at once, gave him a grand blow up in true nautical style. "You're a lazy, good for nothing rascal! You're neither boy, man, soger, nor sailor. You're no more than a thing aboard a vessel. You don't earn your salt. You're worse than a Mahon soger," and other still more choice extracts from the sailor's vocabulary. After the poor fellow had taken this harangue, he was sent into his state room, and the captain stood the rest of the watch himself. At 7 bells in the morning all hands were called aft, and told that Foster was no longer an officer on board, and that we might choose one of our number for second mate. It is usual for the captain to make this offer, and it is very good policy, for the crew think themselves the choosers and are flattered by it, but have to obey nevertheless. Our crew, as is usual, refused to take the responsibility of choosing a man of whom we would never be able to complain, and left it to the captain. He picked out an active and intelligent young sailor, born near the Kennebec, who had been several Canton voyages, and proclaimed him in the following manner: "I choose Jim Hall. He's your second mate. All you've got to do is, to obey him as you would me, and remember that he is Mr. Hall." Foster went forward into the forecastle as a common sailor, and lost the handle to his name, while young foremast Jim became Mr. Hall, and took up his quarters in the land of knives and forks and teacups. Sunday, October 5th. It was our morning watch, when, soon after day began to break, a man on the forecastle called out, "Land ho!" I had never heard the cry before, and did not know what it meant, and few would suspect what the words were when hearing the strange sound for the first time; but I soon found, by the direction of all eyes, that there was land stretching along on our weather beam. We immediately took in the studding sails and hauled our wind, running for the land. This was done to determine our longitude, for by the captain's chronometer we were in 25° west, but by his observations we were much further, and he had been for some time in doubt whether it was his chronometer or his sextant which was out of order. This landfall settled the matter, and the former instrument was condemned, and becoming still worse, was never afterwards used. As we ran in toward the coast, we found that we were directly off the port of Pernambuco, and could see with the telescope the roofs of the houses, and one large church, and the town of Olinda. We ran along by the mouth of the harbor, and saw a full rigged brig going in. At 2 P.M. we again kept off before the wind, leaving the land on our quarter, and at sundown it was out of sight. It was here that I first saw one of those singular things called catamarans. They are composed of logs lashed together upon the water, have one large sail, are quite fast, and, strange as it may seem, are trusted as good sea boats. We saw several, with from 1 to 3 men in each, boldly putting out to sea after it had become almost dark. The Indians go out in them after fish, and as the weather is regular in certain seasons, they have no fear. After taking a new departure from Olinda, we kept off on our way to Cape Horn. We met with nothing remarkable until we were in the latitude of the river La Plata. Here there are violent gales from the southwest, called pamperos, which are very destructive to the shipping in the river, and are felt for many leagues at sea. They are usually preceded by lightning. The captain told the mates to keep a bright lookout, and if they saw lightning at the southwest, to take in sail at once. We got the first touch of one during my watch on deck. I was walking in the lee gangway, and thought that I saw lightning on the bow. I told the second mate, who came over and looked out for some time. It was very black in the southwest, and in about 10 minutes we saw a distinct flash. The wind, which had been southeast, had now left us, and it was dead calm. We sprang aloft immediately, and furled the royals and topgallant sails, and took in the flying jib, hauled up the mainsail and trysail, squared the after yards, and awaited the attack. A huge mist, capped with black cloud, came driving towards us, extending over that quarter of the horizon, and covering the stars, which shone brightly in the other part of the heavens. It came upon us at once with a blast, and a shower of hail and rain, which almost took our breath from us. The hardiest was obliged to turn his back. We let the halyards run, and fortunately were not taken aback. The little vessel paid off from the wind, and ran on for some time directly before it, tearing through the water with everything flying. Having called all hands, we close reefed the topsails and trysail, furled the courses and jib, set the fore topmast staysail, and brought her up nearly to her course, with the weather braces hauled in a little to ease her. This was the first blow that I have seen which could really be called a gale. We had reefed our topsails in the Gulf Stream, and I thought it something serious, but an older sailor would have thought nothing of it. As I had now become used to the vessel and to my duty, I was of some service on a yard, and could knot my reef point as well as anybody. I obeyed the order to lay aloft with the rest, and found the reefing a very exciting scene, for one watch reefed the fore topsail, and the other the main, and every one did his utmost to get his topsail hoisted first. We had a great advantage over the larboard watch, because the chief mate never goes aloft, while our new second mate used to jump into the rigging as soon as we began to haul out the reef tackle, and have the weather earing passed before there was a man upon the yard. In this way we were almost always able to raise the cry of "haul out to leeward" before them, and having knotted our points, would slide down the shrouds and backstays, and sing out at the topsail halyards to let it be known that we were ahead of them. Reefing is the most exciting part of a sailor's duty. All hands are engaged upon it, and after the halyards are let go there is no time to be lost, no sogering or hanging back then. If one is not quick enough, another runs over him. The first on the yard goes to the weather earing, the second to the lee, the next two to the dog's ears, while the others lay along the bunt, just giving each other elbow room. In reefing, the yard arms, the extremes of the yards, are the posts of honor, but in furling, the strongest and most experienced stand in the slings, or middle of the yard, to make up the bunt. If the second mate is a smart fellow, he will never let any one take either of these posts from him, for if he is wanting either in seamanship, strength, or activity, some better man will get the bunt and earings from him, which immediately brings him into disrepute. We remained for the rest of the night, and throughout the next day, under the same close sail, for it continued to blow very fresh; and though we had no more hail, yet there was a soaking rain, and it was quite cold and uncomfortable, the more so because we were not prepared for cold weather, but had on our thin clothes. We were glad to get a watch below, and put on our thick clothing, boots and sou'westers. Toward sundown the gale moderated a little, and it began to clear off in the southwest. We shook our reefs out one by one, and before midnight had topgallant sails upon her. We had now made up our minds for Cape Horn and cold weather, and entered upon every necessary preparation. Tuesday, November 4th. At daybreak saw land upon our larboard quarter. There were two islands of different size, but of the same shape, rather high, beginning low at the water's edge, and running with a curved ascent to the middle. They were so far off as to be of a deep blue color, and in a few hours we sunk them in the northeast. These were the Falkland Islands. We had run between them and the main land of Patagonia. At sunset the second mate, who was at the masthead, said that he saw land on the starboard bow. This must have been the island of Staten Land, and we were now in the region of Cape Horn, with a fine breeze from the northward, topmast and topgallant studding sails set, and every prospect of a speedy and pleasant passage round. End of Story 7, Part 2. Biographical Notes. Dana, R.H., American author and lawyer. Born 1815, died 1882. Graduated at Harvard 1837. Afterward shipped as common sailor, and made a voyage to California. He described the voyage in 2 years before the mast. Became a distinguished maritime lawyer, and wrote The Seaman's Friend, To Cuba and Back, and edited an edition of Wheaton's International Law.